4 shows a week on the Opry. I do 2 on Friday night and 2 on Saturday night.
Little Jimmy Dickens might have been known for his small stature, but it's his larger-than-life talent that still lives on in the world of country music. He was truly the heart and soul of country music and has left a legacy worthy of his stardom. However, behind all the glitter and jokes was a dark cloud. His final years were marked by his disappearance from the public eye and a series of strange life choices. After he passed away, questions began to swirl. What happened to Little Jimmy Dickens? The answers might just surprise you. Journey to country fame. Once upon a time in the coal country of West Virginia, there was a poor boy, James Cecil Dickens. Never in his wildest dreams would he have ever known he would one day rise from the coal country to country fame. Born in 1920, Little Jimmy Dickens grew up in a tiny, overcrowded home. There was no electricity, and the only connection they had to the world was a little radio. It was on this very little radio that Little Jimmy Dickens found his true calling. All he had to lean on was the voice of Jimmie Rodgers, the original singing brakeman, and something about Rodgers ignited a flame in the heart of young Jimmy. As he became a teenage boy in high school, he already had a knack for performing. He would perform on local radio stations and even travel from one town to the other with his guitar, all while sleeping in his car. The journey to stardom wasn't an easy one, and he was more than ready to take the wheel. He knew he had something special, whether he could leave the crowd in awe, his magnetic and undeniable energy, or even his ability to work the audience by leaving them in fits of laughter through his use of self-deprecating humor. At such a young age, Little Jimmy was already going places, and nothing could have gotten in the way. By the time the late 1940s rolled in, Jimmy had begun his journey to the Grand Ole Opry thanks to the encouragement of prominent figures in the Nashville scene like Roy Acuff. So, Jimmy joined the Grand Ole Opry, and this was the defining moment that later shot him up to an iconic level. His journey to country fame wasn't without any downsides. At the start, his small stature caused quite a ruckus, as some promoters viewed him as unusual because of his physical appearance. They put him in a stereotypical box and would often cast him as a comedic sidekick, starving him of the desire to be taken seriously as an artist. It was a tough road for Little Jimmy Dickens, but he didn't back down easily. He worked his heart and mind out, and with songs like Take an Old Cold Tater and Wait, and May the Bird of Paradise Fly Up Your Nose, he was able to turn things back in his favor. And soon enough, he was working the crowd and laughing with the crowd instead of being the butt of the joke. Little Jimmy continued to work hard, and while he told jokes, no one knew of the pain he carried around. His biggest insecurity remained the fear of being underestimated. There were lonely nights after shows when he would stay awake, wondering if the applause and accolades would fade away when the jokes got old. Luckily for him, the jokes never got old. Jimmy became the heart and humor of country music, a unique feat that raised him to greater heights. He began touring the world, appearing on television, and he even became a mentor to younger artists. While other artists in his field began to fade away from the limelight, he stood out and stood still in the world of country music. They say the road to the top can get lonely and dark, and for Jimmy, it was beginning to look that way. As he rose to fame, he began to encounter various people behind the scenes, from managers to promoters and accountants. These were new characters in his journey, yet not all of them had the best intentions for Jimmy. Rumor has it that some quietly manipulated him, moving his money around, controlling his books, and even puppeteering his schedule to ensure he was too busy to notice and question where his earnings were going. As Jimmy got older, he began to lose sight of everything. He no longer could stand on 10 toes when it came to his dealings. He no longer paid attention to the small print. This is when the mystery truly began to unravel. By the time Jimmy got to his 80s, it seemed as though he was no longer in charge of his affairs, and there seemed to be a puppet master pulling all the strings behind the scenes. The dark mystery of Little Jimmy Dickens' later years. As time went on, and as Little Jimmy Dickens reached the age of 80, he still held on to his title as a country music legend. He was revered all across the world and still killed it on the Grand Ole Opry stage. He held on to his humor too, telling jokes with stars like Brad Paisley and also still belting out country tunes in his uniquely talented high-pitched voice. In the public eye, he was still the same man who loved to entertain his audience with humor and music. Fans witnessed the legendary entertainer as he defied age and stood the test of time. Little did they know that behind closed doors, there was a different story altogether, and things were changing quietly for the star. His health slowly began to take a turn for the worse. He began missing rehearsals due to confusion in schedules, and there was also a noticeable change in his performances. Things weren't looking good for Jimmy, and people began to worry for him. Some chalked it up to old age, and others, closer to him, were concerned that something sinister was happening. They began to notice that Jimmy wasn't just slowing down because of his age. He was purposely being pushed to the sidelines. While all of this was happening, whispers began to float. At the same time, there was also an apparent shift in how his estates and finances were being handled. According to insiders, high-ranking members of Jimmy's management who had been by his side for decades were doing the unthinkable. They began taking advantage of Jimmy by taking on more responsibilities without his knowledge. Behind the scenes, there were numerous unauthorized dealings. Oftentimes, legal documents would be updated silently without Jimmy's say-so. There were changes made regarding access to bank accounts. It gets even worse. Decisions were made about ownership of his properties, his prized possessions, and even the royalties he made off performances. All of these decisions were made without his full understanding and permission. In his waking life, it was clear that things were going on behind closed doors, and the people closest to him began to worry. One disturbing detail after another began to rear its head, but nothing was ever certain. In 2015, after his passing, a disturbing detail emerged. You're probably wondering what led to his demise. Stay tuned and we'll unveil the details soon. As it turned out, many of Jimmy's assets that had been in his name for years, including a historic home in Brentwood and an invaluable collection of stage-worn costumes, were sold out or transferred just months before his passing under suspicious circumstances. The most despicable thing about it is that all the paperwork seemed to be in order, but many people wondered if there was more to it than met the eye. People questioned if 94-year-old Jimmy Dickens was in the right state of mind or even had the cognitive capacity to authorize those decisions. More twists were still ahead, and more truths surfaced for the world to hear. These twists had to do with Jimmy's final will, and what his family found shocked them to their core. There were updated versions of Jimmy's final will that made it up to the surface. These versions saw to it that longtime friends and family of Jimmy's were cut out, while individuals who gained influence over him in his later years were highly favored. This came as a shock to people close to Little Jimmy Dickens. He was known to have a generous spirit toward his friends and even aspiring musicians in the Opry community. So, how on earth was there no mention of them in his final arrangements? This left many people shocked and baffled. Soon enough, people began to whisper, and the whispers turned into silent investigations. Questions about whether Jimmy was yet another victim of elder financial misuse arose, but there was never any formal investigation pursued. As these whispers began to turn into loud opinions, many people close to Jimmy claimed that he simply didn't want to make waves, and he trusted the people around him even while his mental well-being declined. Other people begged to differ, believing he was manipulated. As more details came to light, it was heartbreaking to fathom that a legend in the country music scene could have endured such a horrid end. The mystery behind his final years became unclear and shady. However, the truth began to make its way to the surface in ways no one saw coming. The exploitation of Little Jimmy Dickens. The final years of Little Jimmy Dickens's life will forever be marred by the memories of his feeble old age. As his health continued to decline at a rapid pace, so did everything else, including the certainty surrounding his care. In the last 2 years of his life, he began to make fewer public appearances, and when he did take the stage, oftentimes at special Grand Ole Opry events, fans would notice how feeble he had gotten. He needed more help getting on stage and off the stage. He would take longer pauses between his signature jokes, he moved way slower, and he was no longer as strong as he used to be. You might be thinking this is normal for a man his age, and you're not wrong. However, for those who knew him better and those within the Opry walls, there was just something that didn't feel right about the situation. As chatter began to rise behind the scenes, Jimmy's condition worsened over time. A man who once prided himself on his independence now had to be entirely reliant on a small circle of handlers. These handlers weren't just caregivers, they were advisors, managers, and even people he called his friends. They had taken over everything, from his medical decision to bank access. They had a subtle control over Jimmy's affairs, but it was a complete takeover. The takeover went beyond his assets and property. It also became a dictatorship. It is alleged that Jimmy's close friends and the remaining family members he had left were all blocked from seeing him. Calls were left unanswered, and visits were rescheduled more times than anyone could count. It was a brutal situation to be in, and a source who worked backstage at the Opry gave first-hand details about the state of Jimmy's mind. The source stated that Jimmy would occasionally get confused during rehearsals. This was a heavy blow to everyone who witnessed it. Jimmy was no longer in one piece. The dementia was now deeply rooted, and his mental state was way worse than what the public thought. This begs the question, if his mental state wasn't all there, who was truly making decisions for Jimmy during that time? The most outrageous red flag in all of this was a legal transfer made quietly and months before Jimmy passed. it was reported that a trust designed to manage Jimmy's estate had been amended to grant significant control to certain individuals who had just entered his circle. These weren't his longtime friends or Opry family members. They were strangers with financial gains in mind and legal leverage. The story gets even trickier because around this same time, Jimmy's lifelong friends decided to intervene, so they called the necessary authorities with major concerns of elder financial misuse and undue influence. Unfortunately, since Dickens was technically regarded as competent on paper, no formal action could have been taken. One of those friends later revealed the truth, stating that Jimmy once muttered, "They are taking everything, but I am too tired to fight." From this statement, it is entirely possible that Jimmy was aware of the sinister acts happening around him. However, was he forced into silence, or had his mind been completely lost to the point where people could take advantage of him? As these disturbing truths continued to reveal themselves, fans and people dear to him couldn't help but question what went on in Jimmy Dickens' final years. The evidence continued to pile up slowly but surely. As people put it together, they realized that the man who poured his heart into country music might have lost his independence and mental capacity along the way. There were still important questions looming in the wake of these revelations. People continued to wonder who the mastermind was and why they did it. After Little Jimmy Dickens passed away, fans began to mourn his loss with heartfelt music farewells and tributes. While they mourned, something fishy was going on behind closed doors. Reportedly, Jimmy's estate had become a battlefront, and everyone wanted a piece. This was a man known around the world for his signature rhinestone look and his larger-than-life personality. His legacy was worth more than anyone could imagine, and he had the finances and cultural significance to back it all up. In the months after he passed away, people began to wonder about how his assets were distributed. There was a lot of confusion and buzz over how little his liquid wealth was after all was said and done. This was surprising for a legendary icon who had over 60 years on the Grand Ole Opry stage, a man who toured the world religiously and made limitless appearances on television. Surely he had made a fortune, and he lived a relatively modest life. So where did the rest of his wealth go? As people wondered, more suspicious financial activities were dug up. Court filings showed that some of Jimmy's properties were sold before he passed. These sales and transfers were done on the down low without any publicity, and often to LLCs connected to certain individuals connected to his end-of-life care. Not only was a family home he owned in Nashville sold, but an insider close to the Opry community revealed that Jimmy's favorite and most prized guitar collection had disappeared after he passed away. These guitars were vintage, and many of them were autographed by legends such as Hank Williams Sr., George Jones, and Merle Haggard. Many of these guitars were never logged in any official inventory, and to this day, they are still nowhere to be found. The revelations were stacked against the perpetrators as more damaging information came out. Turns out, there was a set of leaked emails between one of Jimmy's financial advisors and a third-party collector. In these emails, both parties talked about moving items before probate and expressed worry over a potential lawsuit by Dickens's extended family. What these emails suggested was that people close to Jimmy may have been getting ready to liquidate assets before they could even be legally challenged. In the meantime, one of Jimmy's few remaining blood relatives, his niece, tried to contest the will. According to her argument, her uncle's declining mental state made him a target and made him susceptible to extreme influence. She stated that the changes made to his estate plan in his final months were not indicative of the man she knew. She had a petition drawn out and ready. Those petitions included affidavits from old friends, former bandmates, and even a retired nurse who claimed that Jimmy was barely aware of what was happening in his final days. While her petition held onto some strong claims, the court dismissed it due to a lack of medical documentation, and by that time, most of the estate had already been sold out or divided. It was clear as day that this was beyond suspicious, and it was beginning to feel as though Little Jimmy Dickens' legacy had been torn apart even while he was still alive. This was a case that left fans, friends, and family devastated. They desperately wanted answers, and as time passed and as investigations dug deeper, it became clear that someone or many people benefited from Jimmy's state of mind. Who was the mastermind? 6 months had passed after Little Jimmy Dickens passed away, and people began to talk. These weren't just his fans and family, it was also people within the country music scene. They began to talk about their suspicions. Something felt off and strange about Jimmy's final moments. Soon, people began to bring in anonymous tips and testimonies. Soon enough, they began to connect the dots, and these dots drew a picture of manipulation and exploitation. The Opry stagehand who had worked with Jimmy for years was one of the first to speak out. He claimed that in the year leading up to Jimmy's passing, access to the performer had become limited. Close friends and family were denied visits, and Jimmy was kept under the watchful eye of his newly appointed assistant. The assistant was someone few people had never seen before, yet somehow he was managing Jimmy's schedule and all that concerned him. The assistant had been brought on by a third-party management company hired to oversee Jimmy's daily affairs. This was where things got even more dicey, as it turned out. Nobody knew who vetted the company. Former colleagues stated that Jimmy always had a handle on his affairs with a small circle of trusted people. However, in the wake of his final months, it seemed as though his small circle had been uprooted, and in its place was a group of strangers. More red flags continued to surface as a longtime Opry photographer recalled an unusual situation. According to him, he had seen Jimmy backstage, sitting alongside in a wheelchair, lost in a haze, and staring blankly into space. It was a whiplash moment for the photographer. This wasn't the Jimmy everyone knew and loved. He had become the opposite of all he used to be. When the photographer approached Jimmy, the assistant was right there to stop him, stating that Jimmy wasn't up for visitors. This was a rude awakening to what was going on, and it wasn't the only red flag. Other people began sharing similar incidents, and these incidents were just as sinister as the ones before. It was clear that day that not only was Jimmy going through a difficult time with his health, but he was also being isolated from the people who cared the most. Meanwhile, based on documentation, it was clear that legal changes were being made, from power of attorney to will amendments and even ownership of property. All of these legal changes were made during the cold and suspicious period of isolation. While these changes were technically legal, people couldn't help but wonder if foul play had been involved. Local investigative journalists began to show interest in the story, so they started digging, but they were met with resistance. Their phone calls were ignored, they were never presented with complete records, and the main players involved either refused to give statements or were out of state and out of reach. To make matters worse, just weeks after Jimmy's funeral, the management company involved had dissolved. There were no board of directors to hold accountable, and there was no paper trail. It was almost as though they never even existed. As people continued to talk about Little Jimmy Dickens and his final days on Earth, a new name began to emerge. It was a name that had not been mentioned in earlier reports, but all of a sudden had become an essential part of the investigation. This name belonged to Jimmy's former business partner turned silent executive of his estate. His relationship to Jimmy was officially tagged as a longtime friend, but people who knew Jimmy the most confessed that he had not been in contact with this person for over 10 years. Yet he somehow re-emerged months before Jimmy's passing, and he took control over huge amounts of assets, contracts, and legacy rights. The shocking revelations did not end there. It was revealed through financial records obtained by a Nashville probate clerk that there was a significant increase in consulting fees drained from Jimmy's estate after he passed away. It was reported that tens of thousands of dollars were redirected to various shell companies, and these companies were all linked to this former business partner. It got even worse because these withdrawals were reported to have begun just days after Jimmy passed, meaning that the plans had begun even before he lost his life. As all of this continued to spiral, Mona Dickens, Jimmy's widow, went silent in public. This was surprising, as she was once a big believer in protecting her husband's legacy, but this time around, she said nothing. According to insiders, Mona Dickens was under so much pressure and was advised not to speak to the media or lawyers. There were reports of threats she had received. They were warnings to scare her off from digging into things. According to close family friends, she always looked nervous, scared, and exhausted. She had become a shadow of herself and was almost unrecognizable from the woman who used to stand beside Jimmy during every big Opry occasion. Little Jimmy Dickens' legacy was slowly being erased by callous minds. His Opry memorabilia and personal items were slowly disappearing. He lost his guitars, handwritten lyrics, and even original costumes for the Grand Ole Opry. These items began showing up at auctions and collector groups around the country, and no one fessed up about how they had gotten the items in the first place. It wasn't just his items that disappeared, even legal ownership of Jimmy's music catalog began to change. Some of his least popular yet high-value recordings were quietly transferred to publishing companies that had not worked with Jimmy in decades. These royalties should have gone to his dear widowed wife instead, along with his estate, which was also being redirected to unknown LLCs with vague addresses in Delaware and Wyoming. As things got murkier, a former attorney of Jimmy's, who is now retired, stated that in the years before his passing, Jimmy had conveyed a sense of deep worry about the people who had been circling him like vultures in a bid to exploit his fame. The attorney's statement was the last drop. He said that Jimmy was afraid of being manipulated and even forgotten, but he was just too trusting and too tired to fight back. As more clues and context came out, the dots were beginning to connect. The truth was even more sinister than anyone had expected. It wasn't just about Jimmy's confused state. There had been some manipulation tactics involved to take away everything little Jimmy Dickens had worked so hard for. The truth revealed. As more suspicious activity continued to happen after Jimmy's passing, more people began to ask questions. More red flags became glaring, and one incident stood out to many people who cared for Jimmy. Reportedly, there was an event that caused a stir among those closest to him. It was a private memorial service that took place behind closed doors and completely away from the public eye, the media, and even lifelong Opry friends and colleagues. Many people found this event to be strange. Little Jimmy Dickens was a huge country star and legend of the Grand Ole Opry. So how on earth was his final goodbye so private and secretive? The explanation that went around was that the family wanted privacy, but former Opry stagehands who worked with Jimmy for 3 decades had a different story. They stated that there was conflicting paperwork around his will, and multiple versions of the document had been circulated. There were more and more incidents that rang alarm bells. As family members got riddled with worry, a distant cousin working as a paralegal in Nashville began collecting testimonies and documents to get to the truth. Now, for the first time, the truth has been revealed for all to see, and it's a cautionary tale about how things could go wrong even for legends. As it turns out, behind all the rhinestones and popularity, there was a dark truth waiting to be found. A confidential deposition recorded months after Jimmy passed away, from a former assistant to the entertainment trust that had taken control of his assets, made its way to the surface. In the deposition, the former assistant revealed that Jimmy had expressed fears in his last year. These fears were not about demise. They were about the haunting possibility of being used. Jimmy had allegedly told her, "They want my name, not me. They want my songs, not my story." This heartbreaking confession sent shivers down spines, and it was confirmed to be a reality once the estate records were examined again. The truth was out, and it turned out the Nevada-based trust had quietly sold licensing rights to several of Jimmy's unreleased performances to international buyers without informing the family. His image had been used in promotion materials for a European tour of virtual country legends, and there were alleged negotiations underway to turn Jimmy's likeness into a hologram act, a sentiment that Jimmy opposed vehemently while he was alive. The truth didn't stop there. A private investigator hired by the family traced one of the trust's shell companies to an executive who was once dismissed from a major country label in the early 2000s over financial impropriety. This same executive was secretly serving as a consultant to the team managing Jimmy's catalog and funneling profits through offshore accounts. The cat was out of the bag, and the scary part of it all was the callousness and the level of deception involved. At the end of the day, little Jimmy Dickens's legacy was robbed by the exploitation of men. They saw the legend merely as a pawn and as leverage, and they contrived to take away control of his life's work. Even through all the nitty-gritty moments, all was not lost for little Jimmy Dickens. The persistence of his family, whistleblowers, and the concern of his beloved fans all over the world led to justice for Jimmy. Thanks to them, efforts are now underway to fix Jimmy's legacy back in shape and order. A new foundation bearing his name has also been proposed. The foundation will be established for forgotten legends as a way to protect their music and legendary memory. Little Jimmy Dickens is what legends are made of. People may have tried to take his legacy away, but in the end, the truth and justice prevailed. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel for more. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.